Hi, David Talp here, nextlevelguitar.com, and we've been getting inundated with emails lately with questions about amp choices. So I thought I would talk about how to choose an amplifier and how to make your decision a little easier. Now, here's what happens. A lot of times we get emails, and Tim and I, we try to answer all the emails that we get, hundreds of emails every week, because we like getting back to the good people. Don't we, Tim?
We love it.
Yes, indeed. I'll get a question like this. It'll say, hey, David and Tim, what's up? I'm in the market for a new amplifier. What can you recommend? Right? And that's...
Need a little more data.
Exactly. That's exactly the email we get. And we get that email constantly, right? And I usually email back, hey, thanks for writing us, checking out our videos. I need a little bit more information to make a recommendation for you. Please answer these questions. And then they email me back and we go. So what you want to do when you're trying to decide on an amplifier is you have to funnel your choices down, because there's so much stuff on the market and it could get totally overwhelming. So you really have to funnel it down. And here's how you do that. The first question you have to ask yourself is what's the application? Do I need an amplifier for practicing in my bedroom? Do I need an amplifier for jamming with my friends? Do I need an amplifier for playing with a live band in small clubs? Do I need an amplifier that playing in large clubs? Application will point you to the right direction. There's no sense buying a Marshall half stack if you're going to be just using it to practice in your bedroom. Okay, that's a waste.
What about Back to the Future, Michael J. Fox? That was a stack.
That was a stack indeed.
See that movie? It gets blasted through the whole
Yeah, that's a pretty cool scene. It gets blasted. Back to the Future through his amps. So, yeah, decide what you need the amp for. Do you need it for practicing with the band, whatever, and that will steer you to some choices. If you just need an amp for practicing in your bedroom, then you want to go with a small combo amp, something that isn't going to make a lot of noise and you don't have to really crank up too loud to get a decent tone out of. So application will steer you into the right direction. The second thing is budget. Okay, so remember, we're funneling our choices down. There's no sense looking and trying out, unless you just want to go and have some fun, no sense playing through a $1,500 amp if you have a $300 budget, okay? That has impulse purchase written all over it. And I'm not saying don't go to Guitar Center or whatever big music store and try out stuff. That's a lot of fun. But if you're seriously looking for an amp, you have to have a budget in mind, and the budget will sometimes tell you, okay, what amp or amp family you're going to go to. The next thing you want to do after application, so remember, think of all the choices and then we're funneling them down like a big, branches of a tree. Application, then you have budget, and the third thing is, do you like solid state or tube amplifiers, okay? Two totally different sounds. Generally, I prefer tube amps. In my live amps, I use all tube amps. But the thing is about tube amps, there's positives and there's negatives compared to solid state. A lot of it depends on what sound you like best. So really let your ears guide you and find out what sounds best to your ears. I like the warmth of tube amps, but the downside to tube amps, I think they sound better than solid state amps generally. But the downside is they're more expensive. You have to maintain them, and for most of them set the biasing and replace tubes. And you have to really crank them up to get the tubes breaking up and getting them to sound really good. You can't have a Marshall half stack or a big Fender DeVille amp on 0.5. It's not going to sound that good. You have to...
Get it on 11.
Exactly. Like Nigel, you got to crank it up, because with tube amps, you have to get those tubes hot, heated up. You have to get the voltages up there so the tubes can talk back and forth, and you really have to get the amp to run hot, okay, to get it to sound really, really exceptional on the tube amps. Obviously, if you're just playing in your bedroom, and you don't want to wake the neighbors, your tube amp isn't going to sound all that great. So if you just blew $1,000 on a tube amp just for playing in your bedroom, you're never going to get your money's worth out of that amp, because you got to really crank it. And they run hot. One amp I use live a lot, I use a Matchless Independence 3-channel amp, and it is hot. It runs really hot. And in fact, in the owner's manual of the amp, it even says don't put a fan behind it or try to cool it off. It's designed to... Tube amps are designed to get hot. So
Now, do you physically, this is a stupid question, do you physically mean, does it get hot? You know what I mean?
Yes. I'm not talking about it gets hot to where it's smoking, but it physically, the temperature really heats up to the point where, ooh, yeah, even the top of it, it gets kind of warm. And that's what you want with tube amps. You really have to get them heated up. You really have to get the voltages cranking, get them loud in order to get the killer tube sound. So that's some of the cons. The big pro, I think, to tube amps is I think they sound better. I use solid state amps too, especially when I'm doing video work and DVD work, because in the studio I can't really crank them up. So I really can't get my ultimate tone here on these videos, because if I play it that loud, the camera mic's going to clip, or you won't be able to hear me over the amp. You won't be able to hear the vocals. So decide what you like best, tube amp or solid state. And a lot of times if your budget is lower, you know, $200, $300, you're not going to afford. Tube amps are generally more expensive too. So
what brand do you recommend for the low end? I mean, just a couple that...
You mean on tube or solid state?
On the low end, solid state.
Well, solid state, solid state has come a long way, and they've made some huge changes in the way that they're built as far as the modeling, where there are now many solid state amps are modeled after a lot of famous amps. And in the past, it was very hard to change the sound of an amp, because in the past it was all in the hardwiring, okay? So in order to make a big change in an amp sound solid state, they'd have to do major changing, which would make it cost prohibitive. But now a lot of those changes are in the software, so it's really easy, and that's why the technology has gotten so incredibly good. And the solid state amps are sounding better and better. For a budget solid state amp, if you want just like a small practice amp for your room, something you don't want to spend a lot of money, I would look at the Line 6. They make some really nice stuff. In fact, a lot of the studio work, I use a little Line 6 Spider 1. They're up to Spider 3 now, but I have an older one, a Spider 1. It's the red one. And you get some really nice tones out of that. It's a really decent sounding little practice amp. Or Vox makes some small practice amps that sound good. The Valvetronics is not bad. That has a lot of kind of cool sounds in it. Fender makes a decent amp, but not the real tiny ones. A lot of the really, like, not budget, with a starter pack, like they'll give you a guitar and an amp, and a lot of those amps, they really don't sound all that good, because the starter packs are based on value. And so it's a cheaper made amp, and a lot of times they really don't sound that great. And that's why I generally recommend staying away from the starter packs, because the guitars aren't made as well, and you want to bump up a little bit if you can. And the amps don't sound all that great. They're not made very well, but it's budget sensitive. Check out if you want an inexpensive practice amp for your bedroom. Even Crate makes a couple pretty decent sounding amps, which are really inexpensive. The cheapest ones probably so far. So the big things you want to do at first is narrow your search down by application, by budget. Do you like tube or solid state? And then the next thing is you want to start narrowing it down by features. When you're buying an amplifier, a lot of times what starts tacking onto the price is what features come with the amp. For instance, some amps come with built-in reverb, okay? And that costs more money. I happen to like a lot of the built-in reverbs, like on the Fender amps, the nice tank reverb, or if it's a nice warm tube reverb. So a lot of the reverbs that are built into the amps sound really nice, especially if it's a nice big tank or a tube reverb. So it's nice having that feature. Now some amps come with that built-in reverb, some don't. The ones that do will cost a little more. If you want an amp with a built-in effects loop, again, that's another feature that costs money. That's a really nice feature to have, especially if you use a lot of pedals effects, because then you could run those pedals through the effects loop instead of, if you don't have the effects loop, then you have to run your guitar into the pedals and then your pedals into the amp. And what that's going to do, it's going to rob your tone, because the pedals then are now your guitar tone is being affected, because the pedals are going through the EQ section and the preamp section, whereas if you have them separately,
you're chopping out the middleman.
Right, exactly. That's a good way to put it. Through the effects loop, all that is separate, and you're getting more of a truer tone. So having that effects loop is a real nice feature. if you use a lot of effects. Obviously, if you don't use a lot of effects, you don't like reverb, don't buy an amp that has all those because you're paying more for that, okay? Some of the other features are you might want, depending on your situation, you might want an amp with built-in distortion, right? Or gain, and a lot of the amps have that. Channel switching, which is really important if you're playing in a band or if you're playing live a lot, meaning there's a channel for clean, and then a lot of times it'll come with a foot switch or a switch on the amp, which you hit, and it'll change the channel to a separate channel, and it might be a distorted channel, okay, or a rhythm channel. Some amps are 2-channel amps where they have 2 separate channels, and then some have 3 channels where you might have a clean, a rhythm, and then a lead. Some have 4 channels, okay? And again, every time you're adding a channel, guess what? The cost is going to go up. Especially some amps have separate channels, but it has the same EQ for each channel, meaning it'll have on the amp, you know, bass, mid, and treble. And you might have all 3 of those for every channel, okay? If you want a separate EQ or a separate bass, mid, and treble knob for each channel, then again, your cost is going to go up. But that's very preferable because then you could really custom tailor each individual sound, your distorted tone, your clean tone. And I like multiple channel amps. I like amps with at least 3 or 4 channels because in the bands I play in, I'm always going from clean to dirty to rhythm. And then I like being able to add an effect pedal, a distortion on top of that. And then so it really opens up a lot of options. But again, you're talking about a lot of extra money. But multiple channels, if you need that or something you want to look for, which are outstanding. I love multiple channel amps. And then obviously you'd want that to come with a foot switch. So when you're playing live, you just click a switch. You're not going to be able to go over to your amp and click it. You know, you want to just step on it to change the channel. Sometimes even an amp will come with a foot switch where you could step on to change the channels, step on to turn the reverb on and off. Some amps have assignable effects loops where you would step on an effects loop. You can assign a loop to a certain channel, which is very, very cool. But again, you get now a little bit more high tech. Okay, a really good multiple channel amp I use sometimes live is the Fender DeVille, the Hot Rod series, Hot Rod DeVille. That comes in a 410 cabinet and a 212 cabinet. I have the 212. Now this is a combo amp, meaning the chassis, the amp controls, and the speakers are built into the same unit. That's called a combo amp, combination, as opposed to having a separate head and a separate cabinet where it would be 2 separate pieces. I have the Hot Rod DeVille 212 because I like a little bit more bass. The 410s are kind of tight, a little bit more trebly sounding. And that's a 3-channel amp. Not 3 independent channels though. It has 1 EQ section, a bass, middle, and treb for everything. But I really like that sound because it's I love the Fender clean sound. Step on a switch and I get a nice rhythm, distorted tone. Hit it again and it's like adds a boost, so I have like a lead tone. So I really like the Fender 3-channel Hot Rod DeVille. It's a very good amp. Mesa Boogie makes some really, really nice amps. 3-channel, 2-channel, 4-channel. Their Stiletto series is kind of cool. Has that British sound. And their the old ones like the Mark IVs, 4 channels. And they have like the Roadhouse now is not the Lone Star. That's kind of a cool amp. So again, if you're not going to be using multiple channels, there's no sense buying an amp with all these channels in it if you're not going to use them, because again, you're wasting your money. So again, let your application tell you which way you want to go.
How do you feel about used, like buying on eBay versus a Guitar Center for amps? What do people say? Hey, I can get one. What do you feel?
Yeah, used amps. Used amps, you can get a really great deal. You can get a really great deal on eBay or Craigslist for used amps. For solid state used amps, it's generally pretty safe as long as the amp doesn't look all beat up. And because usually if the outside of an amp is beat up, usually it's an indicator that it's been used a lot. It may not be as well taken care of, you know. Solid state amps are pretty solid now, so I really wouldn't have too much trepidations about buying a used solid state amp as long as you go give it the road test, make sure all the knobs and features work, and you're getting a good deal. Buying tube amps used are a little bit more of a slippery slope because you don't know how long the tubes have been in there, you know, And with tube amps, if you play a lot, you're going to replace your tubes quite a bit. You know, you might want to replace them once a year. Remember, with tube amps, another thing is you don't want to wait until the tube blows out to replace it. Because if you wait for the tube to totally blow out, then it could damage like some of the diodes or some other parts of the amplifier if you wait that long. So you never want to wait. Usually the tube amps, you'll start to hear when the tubes go, they'll start to crackle, or you'll start to lose power. You'll be playing and all of a sudden your power will cut way back. Okay, and you want to listen for those signs and have your tube amp maintained regularly. You got to set the bias of it, have your tubes checked, find a good amp guy in your hometown. I like going to mom and pop stores for amps repairs, you know, because there's always like, you find a mom and pop store and there's the mad scientist looking dude with the crazy hair behind there who's been there for 20 years and he's just so into every aspect of electronics, and they'll spend time with you and really explain things and really put extra care into your amp and check it and say, hey, you know what? I tested these tubes, they're starting to leak a little bit, or you might want to think about replacing them, and that's what you want. So you can buy tube amps used, just you have to be really careful and go there and really check them out. On eBay, if you're buying from somewhere in another part of the country, it's kind of like a crapshoot. You know, you got to take their word for it, you know. But sometimes you have to do that with vintage gear, Tim Gilbert, because they don't make a lot of certain amps anymore, and you got to buy.
On eBay, it's just check their feedback.
Right.
And anything that's over a couple $100 and they don't have any feedback, I wouldn't recommend.
Right. Yeah, you want to check.
A scam, but if it looks someone they've been on for a couple of years, a year, and they got a bunch of feedback, I think you're not going to get burned.
Yeah.
My eBay experience.
Yeah, that's a great tip. That's a great tip. Check their feedback. So buying used amps, just be careful. So funnel those choices down. Another thing which you could do with new amps is big music stores like Guitar Center offer, you can try it out for 30 days. Great deal. You could take the amp home with you, take it to band practice, take it to a gig, and try it and see how you like it.
Puppy dog clothes.
What?
They call that a puppy dog clothes in sales because they give you a puppy. Most people aren't going to bring the puppy back.
Right.
So if you get a cool amp, you're probably going to fall in love with it and not going to take it back.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. But that's a great deal because if you don't like it, they'll give you credit and you could try something else. So, and when you go to check out amplifiers in the stores, bring your guitar, okay? Don't, you know, you want to hear how it sounds through your guitar and try all the features on the amp and all your pickup combinations and really give it the road test. So bring your own guitar and line up the amps. Go from one to the next to the next. And even if you have never heard of a certain amp model, or, you know, it's something maybe that didn't interest you in the past, again, they've made so many changes and the technology's gotten so good. Try them all. Try them all and see what sounds best to your ears. It's like a guitar. You know, what feels best in your hands? What sounds best to your ears? I could tell you what I like. I like Fender Stratocasters and Gibson Les Pauls and Paul Reed Smiths, but, you know, you might not like those guitars. You might like Ibanez. You might like, you know, something else. And that's all good, you know. It's all a matter of what you like. So with amps, again, it's very, you know, personal. You have to find out what amp character, what tone do you like, you know. A Fender sounds very different, has very different tonal characteristic than a Mesa Boogie, which sounds very different than a Bad Cat, which sounds different than, you know, a Crate, which will sound different than a Marshall, okay? So all these amps have their own kind of mood to them, and you want to play them all and see what you like. And just because your favorite guitar player uses a certain amp doesn't necessarily mean that's the amp for you, because it'll sound different with you playing through it than it will them, okay? So think about all those things and go to all the music stores and try everything out. They really want you to try them, and the technology and the new products out there is just some amazing stuff. So like a mid-range tube amp, you're probably looking at, you know, like that Fender Hot Rod DeVille, $700, something like that. You know, maybe you can get like a Vox if you like that Vox sound, that British sound. $600-700 for a real decent tube amp that you can play up to like small to mid-sized clubs with. And the prices will keep going up. If you want to start looking at multiple channel amps with separate EQs for each channel, you're probably over $1,000 now in some of the Fender DeVille amps, or like a Mesa Boogie Lone Star, you might be looking at $1,200–1,400, something like that. There's a really cool amp built by Bruce Egnater called Egnater, an Egnater amp. And they make a really cool, built in the United States, 4 channels for about a combo amp for about $1,500. That's a great deal. A made in America amp with 4 channels for $1,500 is a great deal. So you might want to check out that. It has a really good tone to it. I played through that recently. I was really impressed. So and then and then amps just keep going up and up and up in price. You can get into boutique amps, amps like Bad Cat and Matchless, and amps that are made, pretty much one at a time by hand, using things like point-to-point wiring, no circuit boards, total Class A amps. And their tone sounds a little bit better, I think, because they're made one at a time. They're hand-wired. Many of them are hand-wired, like the Matchless amps are all hand-wired, using all copper wire, military-grade components, hand-wired, hand-wound transformers. So they're going to sound a little better, but you're talking, thousands of dollars. The transformer is a very, very important part of the amplifier, and often people don't think too much about transformer. They usually think tubes, right? But the transformer, remember, amplifiers are working off of regulated voltages, okay? And it's the transformer that handles that task. So a lot of amp companies, they look more on, when they're talking transformers, on cost effectiveness. Whereas the boutique amps, like a Matchless, the transformer is actually hand wound. So they really put that extra care and extra time into it, building an amp, one at a time, piece by piece, reflected in the price. Not a very cost-effective way to build an amplifier, but difference in tone. Now, obviously, if you're a working musician who's playing out a lot, you get that money back. I think you should always buy the best equipment that you can afford. But if you just need a couple $100 amp, you're just playing in your room, that's fine too. Don't think you have to buy something super expensive, okay? But buy the best amp that you can afford. You'll be happier in the long run with the sound. Another thing when it comes to amplifiers is that I've learned over the years is, if you want that Marshall sound, if you really like a Marshall and you want that Marshall sound, buy a Marshall, okay? Don't buy a cheaper amp that sounds like a Marshall, because in the end you're not going to be happy with it. Okay, if you really want that certain sound, save up for it and get it, and go to the original. If you like that British tube sound, look at the Orange amps. That's another boutique amp, Orange. They're kind of cool, all very 60s retro look to it. Orange in color, has that cool British sound to it. So if you really like that tone and you're drawn to that, then save up and go for it. So the biggest thing again with amps is funnel your choices down. Okay, really think about application, about budget, about features, about solid state and tube. Also, if you're a working musician or if you're playing out a lot, you want to think of portability. I used to carry around, a big, full stack and 412 cabinet, and after a while, it's like, it's just
gotta hire a moving company.
Yeah, it's like, it's just such a hassle hauling all that gear around, That's why the combo amps are so attractive, because just grab it, it has the amp and the speakers right there, everything in one. So if you're out there playing a lot, you're gonna come a day where you're gonna be saying, you know what, I really want to try to strip down my gear and maybe not haul around so much stuff. Besides, unless you're playing a stadium or some outside festival, you don't need full stacks. 212, because you're going to mic it and go through the PA anyway. So a 212 cabinet is basically all you need for most small, mid, even large size clubs. And that'll get you through it if you have a good PA system you're playing through. So you also want to think about, portability. And, you have to have enough power, like if you're playing with other people, playing with a band, to be heard, especially if you're over the... So your amp has to be powerful enough to do that. And normally when you're adding more power to an amp, you're adding more weight, okay? More of the amplifier section of the amp. So again, the amps get, kind of heavy, and you have to think about, do I want to be hauling this sucker around all the time? Because it gets to be a drag if you're hauling around a huge amp and you really don't need it. And don't go by wattage, because wattage, a 60 watt Fender is not necessarily as loud as a 30-watt matchless, which may be less loud than a 15-watt orange. Wattage varies per. I really don't even understand it totally, but it varies by company, and there's a lot of variance in wattage, and you can't. It's not apples to apples. A 60-watt Marshall versus a 50-watt Marshall half step versus a 60-watt Fender versus a 50-watt of this. They're not necessarily all equal. The big thing now, what's most trendy, is lower watt vintage stuff, lower watt boutique stuff. Whereas in the past, people had 100-watt Marshalls and 80-watt this, and that's just way too much. You don't need all that power unless you're playing a huge venue or outside somewhere. Most of the time, 30-watt matchless. My 30-watt matchless, I have on 4 in most places. That Fender Hot Rod DeVille, I have it on 5. Plenty of power, So don't necessarily go by 100 watts. And a lot of the amps now have a great feature where you can actually change the wattage. Like a lot of the Mesa Boogies, the Egnator has like a power grid on the back, so you can make channel 1. Let's say if it's a 50-watt amp, you can cut it back to 25 watts. Or like the Egnator, it's a 100-watt amp, but you can make it 25, 50, 75, or 100 watts by moving the sliders. Well, that's a really good feature, because if you're playing in a place you don't have to be too loud, you can kick it down to 25 watts and crank it up more than 100 watts, where it's really not going to be as loud. And again, you want to get those tubes talking. So having an amp with the adjustable output, adjustable amount of watts is a really cool thing. Again, that's going to cost more, but Mesa Boogie has a lot of amps that do that. A lot of amp manufacturers are making that now because they're finding out that's a very, very useful thing and very wanted amongst players. So that's another really cool choice, to have that power grid where you can actually adjust, per your playing situation. Oh, I only need 20 watts now. I'm going to click it to that, or I need a little. I'll kick it up more. So that's a cool thing. So, and the last thing I want to mention is, when you go to buy an amp, make sure you are well researched on price. If it's new, just Google it. Go online, Google it, check out the latest prices, because a lot of stores. Some stores, there's some wiggle room in the prices. Some amp manufacturers, there's no wiggle room. They're saying this is the price you pay, period. Other places, they can move around in price, and you want to make sure you're getting a good deal. So check online, and that's a good mantra for any piece of equipment, right, Tim Gilbert?
You bet. Google it.
Yeah, Google it.
Google it. Go in with a print out the sheet, and they'll match. Every time I go in there, they'll match. They'll want to do the deal.
That's true too. Most places will match prices. So if you find the lowest price and bring it in, just make sure it's the same exact thing. Because if it's not, they're going to say, well, this is model A and you up here model B.
Too bad whenever I've been in.
Yeah, no, they're pretty cool. They want to make sales, So do your homework. All right. We'll see you in the next lesson. Good luck with your amp shopping. If you have any questions, you could email us. But just don't email us and say, which amp should I get? Give us a little bit more information. Take care.